Okay, guys. In this video, we're going to be talking about basically how the Persian Empire uh, was encroaching in on Greece, and ultimately how that led to a series of wars that we collectively call the Persian Wars. Um, so we're starting with this map, which we probably already looked at in class. It's just a little refresher of where we were with the Persians, right? So we talked a couple of things about how the Persian Empire was organized, right? That they were fairly tolerant of others, that they pretty much only cared as long as you paid your taxes, and they didn't really force their beliefs or culture onto you. But still, despite this, the Greeks thought basically that being invaded by the Persians would lead to the end of Greek civilization. So, as you can see here, right, based off of this map, the Persian Empire, by the time of Darius, which was around 500 BC, you see that there's this huge swath of land that they have, right? It includes almost every major civilization we've talked about already, from the Indus Valley to Mesopotamia to Egypt to Anatolia. You've got Persian dominance here. And as you can see, they're encroaching closer and closer to Greece. And all this pales in comparison when you look at the two little dots that are both Athens and Sparta. So the question for us is, what's going on here? How does this, happen? How does this, what's the outcomes? What leads up to it? And what are the main players here? So let's dive right into it. But first, we need to talk about Greek soldiers. This is a Greek soldier called a hoplite. Greeks had many different types of soldiers. The Greek armies were comprised of cavalry, right, men on horseback, archers, um, what we call peltasts, which were basically people who would throw things at the enemy, whether that's from a slingshot or a javelin or something like that. But the most common form of infantry, right, foot soldiers, were called hoplites. And this is roughly what they look like. So I'm going to highlight a couple things here with the mouse. So you'll notice that the big shield, right, a shield that basically covers from their nose to their knees, right? It covers all the major organs. That shield is actually called a hoplong, which is where the name hoplite comes from, right? It's someone who has this type of shield. And as you can see, they hold the shield in their left hand. This was uniform because of the military formation that we'll talk about in a second that we've hinted at already, called the phalanx. So the shields were always in the left hand, and then in the right hand would have been this really long spear. This spear that would have been about 8 to 10 feet long. And a couple things to point out about this. One, this spear was not thrown; it was used to stab at people from a distance. And then when combined with the protective nature of the phalanx, it basically operated as a way to attack people, from a safe distance because you're protected by your shield, um, and kind of get at the enemy that way. You'll also notice, if you're looking closely here, that looks like there's something on the end here, right? This is what's actually called a butt spike. And the butt spike was used really just to balance out the spear. If you guys have ever held like a long handle of something, or like a pool cue, right? Kind of, if you try to imagine like holding it up like this, right? It's gonna be heavy, and it's gonna have you dip down, right? Your wrist isn't quite strong enough to hold on to that, especially from one end, right? Even a pool cue, which is fairly light, you hold it from one end all the way straight out, your wrist will get tired, your shoulder will get tired. So what they did was they put a bunch of bronze on the end of it to balance out the ratio. Whereas now, if you held the spear in the middle, right, which would normally be the balance, it would tilt back, right? It would be too heavy on the one side. This allows the soldiers to hold the spear about 3/4 of the way towards the end, right, giving them a much longer reach with that spear going forward, because it's basically balanced at this point here, as opposed to somewhere in the middle, giving them a longer access to the spear. If something happens to the spear, they have a sword, right? You can see the sword here in its hilt. This is used for hand-to-hand combat, and was really only used if something happened to the spear, or the phalanx had to break, or something along those lines, right? That this was used really as a last resort. The spear was their main weapon. And you also notice the armor, right? This is all bronze plated. You'll notice that their arms are exposed, their legs are fairly mobile, right? It's because they needed to be able to move quickly if necessary during a fight. So you kind of see these like shin pads and the helmet, right? And they would have all had different types of helmets depending on what city state they were from. or what rank they were, right? These were all things that they included. And then the front of the shield would have all been painted also as a way to identify soldiers from different city states and different formations. So this was the main soldier of the ancient Greeks. If you remember from the video that you watched last week, the Persians were lightly armed, right? They didn't even have any sort of metal armor. They were using wicker, which, if you've ever seen a picnic basket or like outdoor patio furniture, right? That wood that's all kind of like weaved together, that's what wicker is. So the Greeks were much more heavily armed than the Persians were, especially at the beginning of the Persian War. So let's take another look at a map here of the Persian Wars. So you'll notice first that this is plural. And if you look at the key at the bottom of this map, you'll notice that there's land campaigns in the 1490s, and then there's another campaign in the 1480s. That's because there was really a series of Persian wars, basically leading up all the way to Xerxes and the Battle of Thermopylae, and then ultimately the Battle of Salamis, which was the decisive battle in the Second Persian War. But you can see a couple things. One, they didn't really sail. The Persian Empire knew that its strength was in their size. They knew that they had the largest army that the world had ever seen at this time. So they knew that putting them in boats and sailing across the Aegean, which maybe might have been easier to do instead of marching all the way up and around, that's going to limit their effectiveness, right? That they basically wanted to show up with a ton of people and basically overwhelm whatever Greek defenses. And you can see another thing I think is interesting to point out here. You'll notice that there are a collection of neutral Greek states, right? This, for example, they're the city-state of Argos, the city-state of Thebes, right, are in this like neutral territory, right? That they tried to stay out of the Persian War. So when we talk about Greeks versus Persians, it's not even all Greeks, right? It's basically Greeks from certain city-states that are banding together to try to fight off the Persians. So let's take a look at really the first Persian War. Okay, so here's how it starts. So as Persia is getting bigger and bigger, and as we saw with the map that we started with, right, it expanded pretty quickly in just a few short years. What that threat is looming large to the Greeks, and if we remember from the movie Troy, from our conversations earlier in this chapter, that the Greeks were really concerned about this idea of glory, right? That you would be remembered for doing something great, that your name would ring throughout the ages, that there was some sort of, basically like a mythical component to your life, that you can then, be remembered forever. So this threat by the Persians, the Greeks are seeing this almost as like an opportunity, right? Like people will talk about this. If we can defeat them, right, we'll be remembered forever. And so they're not really seeing this huge empire that's breathing down their necks as necessarily a bad thing. They know that bronze is cheap, the iron is cheap during this time period because of access to all the mountains, right? Think of the geography here. We know that iron and iron ore is found in mountains frequently. So since Greece is very hilly, then iron is very cheap. If iron's cheap, that means it's easy to have iron weapons, iron shields, iron swords or spears or those kinds of things. So they really are able to fit a lot of their soldiers in a very easy way. We also know that the Greek formation with the phalanx, right? So basically comes from the Greek word turtle shell. So if you imagine an overlapping of Greek shields that then protect everybody inside, like a turtle shell, and then you have the spears coming out at certain points, and then basically what they do is they just walk towards the opponent, right, on the line in the battle at the battlefield. That really does a couple things. One, it's basically impenetrable, right? So if you don't know how to fight that, or if you can't flank it or go around behind, right, it's basically impossible to get your weapons through. The second thing is it allows the Greek soldiers to basically kill a little bit from a distance, right? That they're not necessarily right up face to face with people. They have their shields, they have the spears coming out, and as long as no one falls down, as long as no one gets, kind of leads to a gap in the the phalanx, right, and the interlocking shields, then it's pretty much, um, you know, impenetrable. It's pretty much an invincible war strategy. So you see that gave the Greeks a really big upper hand, right? So we see the cheaper iron, this idea that this will be something good for them, and then ultimately they do have superior military strategy. And this first Persian War begins in the Greek city-state of Ionia, which is on the Greek coast, which is over in this region, right? It's the in Anatolia, right, the modern day Turkey. You had this Greek city-state, kind of like Ephesus or some of these other major cities, Miletus, right, Pergamum, places that you guys should know. These are city-states that are basically Greek colonies. They were populated by Greeks as the Greeks were expanding throughout the Aegean. So you get this Greek city in Anatolia, in the Aegean coast of Turkey, and it gets conquered by the Persians. Right, the Persian Empire conquers all of Anatolia pretty easily in their first expanses out. And that leads to a fight, right? That there's this city state that's being protected and aided by Athens in particular. Athens is almost kind of looking for a fight here. So they kind of send a bunch of aid to the Ionians, and they send them, weapons and soldiers and all this stuff. And this really angers the Persian Empire, Darius the Great. So basically, he has this vow that he's going to destroy Athens, and as retribution for them, retribution for them helping out this rebellious Greek city in the Persian Empire. So he sends a pretty large army, right? 25,000 Persians versus 10,000 Athenians. So they're outnumbered 2-1 at the Battle of Marathon. This is a battle site that is approximately, this will be a shock, about 26 miles away from Athens. And surprise, surprise, due to its cheaper weapons and better military strategy, the Athenians win, right, in this kind of underdog upset victory, right? They're outnumbered 2.5, almost 3-1, right? So that means that for the Athenians to win, they have to basically, each one has to take out 3 guys. And you see that they are successful. And in order to share the success, this is the story, a guy by the name of Phidippides, which is just awesome for a name, runs back to Athens to be like, we won, and drops dead from running 26 miles, because that's a really long distance for people to run. Fast forward, a few hundred years, 1,000 years, and now people do this marathon race. They do it all the time. People do 100 marathons and stuff. People train for it. So it's kind of like this. That's where the word marathon comes from. Is the distance roughly from the battle site to Athens. And once Athens is able to defend itself at Battle of Marathon, and then ultimately defends against further invasions from the Persians, that's the end of the First Persian War. So really, what you need to know about the First Persian War is that's when the main battle of the First Persian War is the Battle of Marathon. Don't get confused with this, because the Second Persian War has some other famous battles that you'll need to know the name of those. And for the last thing I want to show is, I don't know why that just happened, but the last thing I want to show you guys is this. This is a Corinthian style helmet. That was the name of the helmets that the hoplites wore. And you can see that this particular helmet was found with the skull of its owner inside of it still. That's pretty gnarly. And there's a lot of speculation about how this person may have died. If you look at the helmet, you can kind of see through the back. So there's some people that think that he might have been stabbed through the eye, or hit in the back of the head with something, and that ultimately led to his demise. But it's on display at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. Yes, that is the same museum that had the Assyrian lion hunt reliefs. But yes, I was able to take this photo. So that's going to be it for this video. We'll come back and talk about the Second Persian War and kind of the effects of it in the next one. All right, guys, I'll see you then.